whistleblower absolutely ought to be known and testify. Look, they tried to take out a sitting president. Everybody in America has the right to face their accusers. Why should the president be denied that same constitutional right?
That was the House Minority Whip Congressman Steve Scalise yesterday defending President Trump's naming of the alleged whistleblower whose complaint led to the impeachment. For their take, we welcome now our political panel here in New York. Shavar Jeffries, he's partner at Lowenstein Sandler and also president of Democrats for Education Reform. And down in Washington, Rachel Bovard. She's senior policy director at the Conservative Partnership Institute. So, Rachel, just be honest with us. Only the two of us talking. Nobody else is listening. Did you cringe a little bit when you saw the president reveal the name of a so-called whistleblower? Because there are protections about this. The law says something about that.
There are protections about this, but again, there's a legal ambiguity as to whether this is even a whistleblower. He had no firsthand knowledge of the events that took place. And in fact, the intelligence community had to change its rules to allow him to even file a whistleblower report because he had no firsthand knowledge. So, we've seen his name put out there before. I think there are people, like Steve Scalise said, who want to see the whistleblower testify. If these are the allegations that are going to take down a sitting president that 63 million Americans voted for, you'd think he'd want to stand behind those claims.
So, Shavar, we're a long way away from taking down any president, as we know. In fact, most people think he's going to save it. But let's assume that Rachel's right. Will the thing that took him down be that somebody had a tip about something, or will it be about the transcript that the president himself revealed? And he said this is what he said.
Well, I think the transcript is clear. I mean, the president clearly said that, could you do me a favor? And he wanted to leverage favors, personal favors, and leverage public resources, obviously investments in Ukraine. And the president generally has, frankly, a reckless disregard for legal process and legal norms. It is highly improper for any target of any investigation to publicly disclose the identity of a whistleblower. In this kind of Trump context, just basic norms seem to get perverted. And there's a legal process, so there are ways in which a whistleblower can be named, but it has to go through a legal process, not this sort of public process.
Rachel, what about it? Why does it matter how the thing started? It doesn't matter how it finishes. And that is to say, if there are people who have direct knowledge, some of whom have now testified up in Congress, they have testified under oath. Isn't that what matters rather than how it actually got started?
Well, I think if we're talking about norms here, this impeachment process is not a case example of that at all. I mean, we've seen House Democrats blow past every single norm when it comes to how an impeachment process should be handled, including hosting many of their depositions and witness hearings in secret and keeping that evidence from the president himself, which is far and away, a gross break with how previous impeachments have been handled. So, if we're going to talk about norms, every single person is breaking them when it comes to that in this case.
Yeah, so Rachel says both sides are breaking the norms. But let's talk about the norms from the vice president, former Vice President Joe Biden. Yeah. Because the question was, if he gets subpoenaed by the Republicans to appear in a trial, will he appear or not? At first he seems to say, no, I'm not going to appear. Right. Now it's not quite so clear. He says, well, I always comply with legal things, although there's no basis for it. Is he going to show up or not?
Well, unlike the Trump White House, I would hope that the vice president, if there is a valid subpoena, witnesses have to show up in the United States of America. I mean, that's something the Trump White House seems not to understand. There is a legal process to quash subpoenas. So I don't know what the relevance would be of the vice president's testimony with respect to the charges before the Senate and the impeachment hearings, namely the extent to which President Trump abused his power vis-a-vis Ukraine. Vice President Biden really doesn't have knowledge appropriate to that. So if he wants to challenge the subpoena, he should do it through the legal process. But if the subpoena is valid, he has to show up in the United States.
Rachel, what about it? What would the Republicans want to get out of that? Because I haven't seen any indication at all that the vice president, when he was sitting as vice president, was part of anything corrupt. Whatever happened with his son, Hunter, as far as we know, he didn't know what was going on. What do you expect to get out of that?
Well, it's unclear, actually, if he knew what was going on or not. Hunter Biden admitted to the New Yorker magazine that he did talk to his father about it, that he did mention it to him. And this is part of this whole inquiry that has really gone unexplored. Hunter Biden was serving on the board of a notably corrupt Ukrainian gas company while his father was directing $3 billion in U.S. aid to the country. This has not been explored. We know very little about the communications that went on between the White House and Hunter. And so I think if a subpoena is issued, it would be to further examine just what the heck went on there. But again, to the point of whether Joe Biden has to comply with the subpoena, this is the man who is running, saying he has the moral authority to replace Donald Trump. He has to act better in order to get that moral authority. So that means complying with the subpoena.
We're talking with our political panelist, Shavar Jeffries, here in New York, and Rachel Bovard down in Washington. Rachel, do you think the Republicans are feeling any pressure at all to have an actual trial where you call witnesses as opposed to something that's pretty quick, a vote down?
I don't think so right now. I think that all signals point to a shorter trial. I think that a lot of them think this is a sham impeachment. They look at the process the House Democrats put together and they said, look, there's no there. We're going to get on with this as fast as possible. And the Senate has that authority. The Constitution gives the Senate the authority to decide how this trial shall be conducted. And that means both Republicans and Democrats will agree to the rules. So I do think we're headed toward a pretty short trial at this juncture.
Shavar, just as a lawyer, do you have some respect or even admiration for the way that Mr. Cipollone, who is the White House counsel, has conducted this thing? They've been very aggressive at the White House. They said, we don't want our people testifying. We're not going to comply. We're not going to cooperate at all. It looks right now like that's playing out pretty well for them. Was that a good legal strategy?
It was a good political strategy. As a lawyer, lawyers, we're not ethically able to dissuade witnesses from appearing in a valid legal proceeding. So that is just frankly totally unethical and improper from a legal standpoint. It was a great political strategy because if witnesses don't show up, they won't be able to confirm what the president himself said. He was very clear. He said, do me a favor and investigate my primary political opponent, and then maybe we can release some aid. I mean, that's unbelievably clear. If the president never had anything to hide, Mulvaney should testify, Giuliani should testify. They're at the center of this. So politically, it's obviously worked well for the president. Legally, it's highly improper to discourage witnesses from testifying.
So, Rachel, I never thought I'd ask this question in any context, but does this impeachment matter? I mean, normally we'd think absolutely impeachment is critically important. I must say the financial markets have not reacted to it particularly. Politically, is it likely to show up at all in this election year?
Well, let's be very clear about what impeachment is here. It is not a criminal legal proceeding. It is a political proceeding. And so to your point, I don't think it's going to have that much impact on the elections. I think if the polls show this, they show a tremendous amount of impeachment fatigue. The independents, which were the group of people the Democrats had to win to make this matter, they're losing in droves. Some polls show a 10-point swing with independents now refusing to support impeachment, saying it's a bad idea. And so I think people are tired of it. That is not a clear-cut narrative. I think Democrats have overplayed their hand dramatically here. And I think if it matters at all, it's going to drive people toward Donald Trump rather than away from him.
So, Shavar, let's talk about driving toward Donald Trump. USA Today is out with a poll right now with Suffolk University that has an interesting finding, which is basically people they poll, both Democrats and Republicans, think their own personal economic situation going into 2020 is a good one. But they really are not as comfortable where the country is headed, particularly Democrats, I must say, but are not nearly as comfortable. Is there something of a gap between the president's particularly approval rating on the one hand and the economic performance of the country?
I think there seems to be definitely with Democrats. I mean, Democrats generally have just such a visceral opposition to President Trump that I think that shows itself in the polls on a regular basis. I do think many Americans are who aren't invested in the stock market are worried about their economic status. I mean, a recent survey came out and said that about 40% of Americans couldn't afford an unexpected $400 bill. In many parts of the country, people spend half of their money on housing. People worry about college and retirement. So I do think there are some underlying issues in the day-to-day economy that may not reflect in the Wall Street numbers.
Rachel, you get the last word. Are you concerned at all about that gap between the president's approval rating and what the economy is delivering?
Well, I do think the economy is doing well. Certainly there are pockets where it could be doing better. But I think overall the economic picture is sound, and I think you're going to see that reflected in the polls at some point. As James Carville once said, it's the economy's stupid. Democrats can't even deny that the economy is doing pretty well now.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate both of you being here. That's Shavar Jeffries right here in New York and Rachel Bovard down in Washington. Great to have you both with us. Still ahead.